French President Emmanuel Macron addressing the nation with a very clear message that Europe has to unite in the face of what is happening right now to Ukraine. And, of course, the fact that the United States appears to be pulling further and further away from its traditional allies. Let's go straight to the Élysée Palace from where Emmanuel Macron has been speaking. James Andre is our reporter there at the scene. James, good evening to you. This, perhaps in many ways, was expected, but nonetheless, to hear those words as clearly as that, Europe has to unite, the United States pulling away, a different future lies ahead. The message from Macron, very clear.
Yeah, a very strong and clear message from Emmanuel Macron. Very clearly what he's trying to do here is mobilize the French, get them behind him in this new world we are indeed facing. The President said it quite clearly that, the recipes of the past cannot be applied to what is happening now. He did outline what the objectives of this summit that is going to take place, the European summit that's going to take place tomorrow, are going to be. He did explain that there were going to be new tools available, that indeed the deficit rules that had been in place in the European Union were going to be lifted for military spending, also saying that there would be unprecedented amounts of money injected into building a European defence. He also reminded everyone that it is something he's been asking and calling for over the past 8 years. For the people following French politics, this started in the Discours de la Sorbonne back in 2017, and it is something that's been constant in the President's message that there is a need for independence and sovereignty when it comes to European defence. But also a message to the French people saying that, yes, it is in the sense of the end of an era, and that what is going to be required now from the French public is indeed a new mobilisation in the face of a new threat, and a moment where indeed, the French public is called upon to, step up and indeed defend its values.
Indeed, James, one of the things that Macron did point out there is that there will be no tax rises. He was saying that the spending that is envisaged, and I think it's looking at the graph that he put up there during his speech, it's something like a €20 billion increase in spending from now until 2030 to back this remilitarization that he is launching right now. He was saying that would be private-public funding, no tax increases. Now, that is a big thing to say. I wonder how realistic that might be.
Well, look, these are going to be all the question marks that are now on the table. He said that indeed he didn't want tax raises, but he said there would be sacrifices and there would be decisions to be made. He also said that he wanted to see the country reindustrialize, and he said he wanted to see this reindustrialization to take place across all the regions of France. Basically, he said what we need is to have an integrated system where indeed there is European investment for European production, European products, and complete sovereignty when it comes to the complete chain, if you will, of production for these new military tools that are now required in the face of a renewed Russian threat. He actually outlined that threat, explaining that he said that Russia cannot be trusted at face value. There was this graph where he showed how Russian investment was on the rise, how many tanks, planes, men, indeed, Vladimir Putin's Russia was recruiting and producing at the time we are speaking, basically outlining the risk that stood before the European Union by 2030. So Emmanuel Macron very clearly restating France's position there and explaining that yes, France needs to step up, needs to defend Ukraine in order to put it in a position where there can be a peace deal and a solid peace deal. And he said not only for Ukraine and Europe, but he said even if this peace is achieved, yes, there will be sacrifice, investment, and there will be an effort from the French people, though he wants to do that without rising the taxes, and that, of course, is going to be a challenge.
James Andre for now. Thank you very much indeed, James Andre, there at the Élysée Palace, where Emmanuel Macron has just been speaking to announce this remilitarization of France, something that will create jobs. Macron is pointing out in a very positive manner. But of course, this is all about the response to what is happening over Ukraine, with Donald Trump's decisions taken in Washington and at Mar-a-Lago to basically cut off military aid and also intelligence sharing with Kyiv, which is a major blow to Ukraine's existential fight against Russia. Angela Diffley, our international affairs editor, is with us here in the studio. All this is Macron's response to Donald Trump, basically.
It is. I was struck there. I thought he might go in a bit harder, actually, on this issue of preparing the French public for the money this is going to involve, because, as you pointed out, and James too, he has pretty much ruled out tax hikes. There was a lot of talk about this idea of fiscal patriotism, that the wealthy should be asked to pay a lot more to defend the country. The other alternatives are borrowing. That is something that's harder and harder for France to do. It already has a big public deficit. And so what is left is reducing public spending. That is going to go down very badly in a country like France, which so cherishes its welfare state, its social security spending. But that money has to come from somewhere. I think we'll probably talk a bit later about this idea of Russian assets tomorrow in the summit, which that might also release some money. The European Union is also loaning money to various governments so that they might increase their spending on defence. He put a very positive spin on it, talking about the jobs it would involve. That is true. But the French need to get ready to spend a lot on defence. And this has got to come from somewhere. And Britain, because, of course, Keir Starmer made a very similar speech just earlier last week and said that Britain would be taking it from overseas humanitarian aid. France has already cut that by 30%. There isn't a lot of room for manoeuvre there for France. So in a very fractious Assemblée Nationale, with always the risk of a government being toppled, this is going to have to be fought out. Where is this money going to come from?
Angela, stay with us, please. Let's bring in Quentin Peel. Quentin is Associate Fellow on the Europe Programme at Chatham House. Quentin Peel, always a pleasure to have you with us here in France 24. We always appreciate your insight, especially right now, because what we're seeing is a major change in step, not just in France, but across Europe, because of what Donald Trump has done and the policies he's implementing, because of the situation in Ukraine, because of the threat from Vladimir Putin and Russia. How is this going to change Europe going forward? What did you make of Macron's speech?
Well, it is the dramatic Trump effect that we're clearly seeing in France, in Britain, and also in Germany. This all arises really out of Donald Trump being such a suddenly much less reliable ally than we've always taken for granted. So I think that they are all preparing their publics for a really dramatic shift in spending towards defence, and indeed both Britain and France certainly have already in principle said that they would be prepared to put British and French soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, at least to keep the peace, if we can get a peace. But these are huge questions that still remain, because everything that Donald Trump does in America seems to be very much exactly what Vladimir Putin would like him to be doing, cutting off the arms and cutting off the intelligence from Ukraine. That's a real danger.
And this aspect of Trump almost being in lockstep with Vladimir Putin, it is one of the most disturbing aspects of what's going on right now, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I don't think we quite understand it. I mean, why is Donald Trump apparently so smitten by the Russian president? He seems to be very trusting of him, and that was the problem why his talks blew up with Vladimir Zelensky last week, but he kept saying to Zelensky, you must trust Donald Trump. You must trust Vladimir Putin. And as Zelensky finally said, look, I can't. He has a track record. So this is going to be really difficult. The other thing that I think also the big question that hangs over all of this is, if the Europeans have a clear game plan where Europe is going to provide the security for Ukraine to sign up to a ceasefire, will the Russians be prepared to accept European, i.e. NATO, troops on the ground in Ukraine? Because that is totally contrary to everything that Putin has said up till now.
Indeed, and Quentin wonders what shape, what form NATO will take in the weeks to come, because it is moving that quickly. Quentin, bear with us. I'm bringing Angela back in, our international affairs editor, Angela Diffley. Quentin making a good point there about what happens next in terms of boots on the ground in a peacekeeping capacity. Let's state that loudly, in a peacekeeping capacity. But nonetheless, it's hard to imagine that Vladimir Putin would be happy to accept something like that. Give us your thoughts.
It is, and we were, Donald Trump said a while back, yes, I've spoken to Putin about this. He's fine with it, and
it's that
10 minutes later,
Trump says he's fine with it, but
absolutely,
sure,
it appeared that he wasn't. It's interesting what Quentin was saying there about Trump's fascination, obsession with Putin, which is hard to fathom, hard to understand. Equally weird is his dislike of Zelensky, which some people track back to the fact that Zelensky, there was that famous phone call about would he cooperate on finding dirt on Hunter Biden, and that was leaked. It eventually led to attempts to impeach or an impeachment of Donald Trump. Does he still hold all of that against him? It's extraordinary that personal relationships are turning the world upside down to the extent that they are. Also, I think that it's worth mentioning that within Europe, there is a huge problem, and that is Viktor Orban. And tomorrow, at this meeting, he was not invited to those meetings, the London summit over how to respond to the drama in the Oval Office. But he is, a clear, open admirer of both Putin and Trump. And at some point, he has to clarify his position. It is very, very difficult. He will be opposing one of the things they're expected to discuss at their summit tomorrow. The 27 defence ministers and I think heads of state are meeting tomorrow to talk about everything, Ukraine and European defence. And he already opposes the idea of sending aid right now to Ukraine, which so far has no aid because Washington has halted it. Orban really needs to clarify his position. Hungary isn't a huge country, 10 million people, but in the European Parliament, those far-right parties can create a lot of mischief. That said, they are all fairly divided on their attitude to Ukraine. There are difficulties within Europe, but broadly, and Emmanuel Macron has been saying it for years, as he said, Europe has woken up, realises that it needs to shoulder its own defence.
Angela, bear with us. Quentin Peel from Chatham House is hanging on too. Let's go back to James Andre, who's at the Elysée, where Emmanuel Macron made his speech just a few moments ago. James, I hope you can still hear us. I understand James no longer available. Technical issues, I'm afraid to say. We're hoping to get more insight from our reporter at the courtyard there at the Elysée Palace, but James Andre sadly indisposed. But we do have Angela Diffley and we do have Quentin Peel from Chatham House, who we'll go to next. Quentin, this issue about getting Europe united, Macron was very clear on that. It's what has to happen, he says. But as Angela was just pointing out, with the likes of Viktor Orban in the family, it's easy to see that it could become a family, in the broader sense, at war.
I think it's a real problem. I mean, obviously, they've known this for a long time, that Viktor Orban was going to be the difficult man. I think I read that he was due to have... Is he going to have supper tonight with Monsieur Macron?
We're getting a head nod on that one, yes.
Right, OK. Yes. But the other key country here, which is a little bit in limbo, of course, is Germany. Germany, which has just had an election. We have a new chancellor who's going to be taking over, but hasn't done so yet, in Friedrich Merz. He is making very much the right sort of noises, I think. He said straight away, as soon as the election was over, we've got to get our act together. We can no longer rely on the Americans to provide our security. Europe has got to unite. So I think that Emmanuel Macron will have a good and strong ally in Friedrich Merz. The question is, will Olaf Scholz invite him to come along to the summit in Brussels tomorrow? I'm not sure that we are that far. We have to be waiting for Germany, and yet there is very little time to lose. They need to take urgent action.
It is one of these things that needs, as you say, urgent action. Macron calling for Europe to be united and obviously calling on all the European partners to increase their defence spending. And that is another issue, isn't it? Getting those attitudes to change towards this issue. It's one that Donald Trump flagged up, of course, on more than one occasion. We can go back to his previous mandate when he was Trump 45. Now, of course, Trump 47. He actually flagged this up, that Europe wasn't spending enough on its defence.
Yeah, and of course, one must give, I suppose, credit, at least in this, to Donald Trump, that actually he has finally put a real bomb under the Europeans in terms of really forcing them to actually up their own military spending. He's been complaining for years, not only Donald Trump, other Americans too. And I think finally the Europeans realize that they are going to have to spend more money on defense. And it's not a popular thing in all the countries of the European Union and indeed in Great Britain.
On the issue of tariffs, Quentin, Macron saying he hopes to persuade Trump not to impose tariffs on European goods, but trying to get Trump to do something that basically might be against what he's thinking or what someone's telling him to think. Easier said than done.
Yes, absolutely. And I was watching his speech to Congress during the night. And he's adamant that that is still the way he's moving forward. The trouble with Donald Trump is he is so unpredictable. He says one thing one week and then he seems to reverse it the next week. Certainly, I think he's going to get quite a lot of pushback on the question of tariffs, not so much from the people on whom he's imposing them, but from his own business people. You saw the reaction on Wall Street when he said he was going ahead with the tariffs on Canada and Mexico and China, and Wall Street instantly dropped. So he says now he's going to go ahead with what he calls reciprocal tariffs on April the 2nd. And as far as I can see, he means it. But then at the end of the day, will he suddenly change his mind if he realizes it could actually be a very negative thing economically for the United States?
That's one of these things, Quentin, isn't it, that when Trump is looking at his figures, and he does look at his figures, it matters to him whether he's popular or not, regardless of what he says. And in the popular vote, he didn't win by such a massive margin as he says he did. If public opinion starts to turn against him, could that possibly dissuade him from the extreme positions he's taking now?
It looked last night as if he had a pretty united Republican Party backing him. They were on their feet, clapping on every positive thing he said. But having said that, there is, on both Ukraine and on the question of imposing tariffs, there is a clear core of traditional Republican politicians who actually find both things very uncomfortable. They don't want to get into bed with Vladimir Putin, and they don't want to undermine free trade. So he has got to work all the time at keeping his party together. So I think that there is actually some hope that his actual wildest ideas of slapping great swinging tariffs on all his main trading partners, he may back off in the end.
Indeed, it's one of these things. I'll bring Angela back in on this one, Quentin. Please bear with us. We'll come back to you as soon as we possibly can. It's one of these things, Angela, that it's one thing to talk tough about tariffs, but it does have a knock-on effect, which often leads to, and I'm no economist, but from what I've read, it leads to inflation going up. And that's clearly what he doesn't want to happen, Trump.
Absolutely. And businesses, as Quentin said, are already complaining. And whatever Trump cares about, he does care about Wall Street. And markets are already showing jitters. That will give him pause for thought. You know, that said, it's very odd because his reasons for imposing tariffs keep changing. Originally, we were told on Canada that it was about stopping illegal migrants and fentanyl. Same with Mexico. Then it was about something else. It appears that he is wedded to tariffs and finds a reason to impose them. That in itself is a strange policy. And I think, as Quentin says, he will have some pushback from certain Republicans and from business on that. The other thing, of course, about tariffs is when you impose tariffs, those countries on whom they have been imposed look for other markets. And so eventually you don't have that leverage anymore, whether it's the case that Donald Trump simply doesn't care after his 4 years. But it's a risky business. imposing tariffs in such a freewheeling way.
Indeed. Let's come back to the issue of Europe, though, and what Emmanuel Macron was saying about Europe. Just to remind people watching, Angela Diffley, our International Affairs Editor, Quentin Peel from Chatham House for the Europe programme is joining us from afar. Quentin, back to you with Macron's call for Europe to unite. The issue of a European army clearly suggests itself, doesn't it, in terms of this has been something that's been spoken about for many, many years, and it's been something that's been pushed into the long grass and said, well, it can't happen. But now it looks like, with the way things are developing, that this is something that perhaps is now back on the agenda.
Yes, I think it is. I mean, when you say European army, those are the sort of words that cause great anxiety, certainly in the country where I'm sitting, in the United Kingdom. But at least a coordinated European military strategy with close cooperation. The problem with the Europeans is always that the communication between the different countries, the linguistic problems, but also the different systems that they have, is always a problem. Now, how far can they go down this line? I'm fascinated by a particular problem that this creates for Keir Starmer, because here is the United Kingdom, which has stormed out of the European Union with Brexit back in 2016, to my mind, a complete disaster for Britain. But now suddenly they're looking that they may actually be sucked back into a much more militarized European Union, the very thing that they always argued that we shouldn't be doing. NATO was the key to our military future, not the European Union.
Indeed. How great is the threat from Russia, Quentin? Macron was very clear. He said that this is the threat to the whole of Europe and France. But in your view, how great a threat does Russia represent right now?
I think that Russia does represent a considerable threat on issues like cybersecurity. We've seen all the problems that Russian ships have apparently been creating, dragging their anchors through cables across the Baltic Sea. They've been investigating transatlantic cables. Russia is capable of a lot of really serious nuisance, even if I don't think we expect to see Russian tanks steaming across Europe. They're well bogged down in Ukraine for the time being. But Russia is not an enemy that anybody will take lightly.
And I'm wondering what the capacity of Europe will be in order to meet the demands that Emmanuel Macron is talking about. It's increasing the spending from 20 billion euros this year to 70 billion by 2030. I'm wondering, both you and Quentin and Angela here, for some thoughts on how Europe reaches that capacity, how France reaches that capacity to produce the arms that Emmanuel Macron says are needed. Quentin, can I ask you that first?
Well, Angela mentioned earlier the key question of, are we going to use the frozen Russian assets? That's something that both France and Germany have been really rather cautious about, and much keener to say, look, we'll use the income from the frozen assets, but not actually impound the Russian assets. I think we're now getting much closer to the fact that actually that is something that they could do. And there you're talking a very substantial amount of money that could be seized and could help towards financing a much more substantial European military effort.
Indeed. Quentin, thank you. Bear with us. Angela, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets. About, I think, 2 to 3 billion of the interest on that has been used. But until now, that actual money has been frozen, but not seized. And there is, of course, a question of whether that should be seized and that money used. Merz, the new German leader, is apparently a lot more favourable to the idea than Olaf Scholz was. France, we are hearing, is moving perhaps closer to the idea of allowing it. The problem is, of course, is that France is fearful that investors will be pushed away by the idea that investing in Europe could lead to their assets being frozen. And of course, it's Europe that's going to suffer. Britain is quite keen on using these assets, but Britain isn't going to suffer. The United States keeps saying, use those assets. It's Europe that's going to suffer if it does cause investors to shy away. It appears they're moving towards the idea, perhaps, of using it in final negotiations or as leverage and saying, if a ceasefire is agreed and you violate it, then we will seize those 200 billion euros of Russian assets. If they decide to use them right now, it apparently would be a real game changer. You know, it's going to take 10 years for Europe to be able to protect itself. And it's just simply not making enough stuff. It's not manufacturing enough weaponry or equipment. And, you know, you can't do that overnight.
Macron made the point about reindustrialization. There aren't the factories to create the weapons. There aren't the factories to create the hardware.
No. I mean, there's an upside in terms of job creation, which he pushed forward as a positive spin on all of this. It's all about Europe realizing that, as you know, Quentin was saying, we were told NATO was responsible for European defence. It turns out perhaps not quite so much. Time for Europe to shoulder the burden, and that does at least mean jobs. But there's a very significant downside to it.
And as you say, Angela, that's going to take a good decade for that to kick in. So there's lots of work to be done. Let's show you the images coming from the Elysee Palace, where Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, we understand, is arriving. As Quentin Peel explained to us earlier, for supper with Emmanuel Macron. They have much to discuss, of course. Viktor Orban is, I think it's fair to say, far right in his political leanings. He is an ally, and he has said this himself, of Vladimir Putin. He is an admirer of Donald Trump. He has opposed aid for Ukraine, and someone who's been basically a spanner in the works Europe-wise in terms of support for Ukraine along the way. But the two men smiling as they always do for the cameras. But now they go into the Elysee Palace, where the conversation will, I imagine, begin straight away, given the agenda that Emmanuel Macron, Quentin Peel, bringing you in now, that Emmanuel Macron has just outlined. He needs to basically get Orban on side, doesn't he?
I think he does, and I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be a fly on the wall?
Indeed.
I think that Emmanuel Macron realizes what they also realize. He realizes, and so does Keir Starmer, that somebody like Viktor Orban will appreciate the gesture of being made, of being invited to come to dinner in the Elysee immediately before the summit. He will be somewhat flattered, just as Donald Trump is flattered to get the personal attention, for example, with Keir Starmer bringing along an invitation to dinner with King Charles. And so there is a touch there of how to get round it. But Viktor Orban has been very consistent in being pro-Putin and pro-Trump. He's not an easy man to deal with at all.
Very difficult to see how he's going to make the Hungarian leader change his stance. And of course, in Slovakia, it's Robert Fico who also shares Orban's kind of agenda.
Indeed it is. And I think that this is the real challenge to European unity. If they can get all the traditional Europeans around, and now the key person here may be somebody like Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, because she comes from the far right, but in fact has always been much more sympathetic, both to Ukraine in particular. And so she could play a role in bringing people together. But Europe is not in an easy place at the moment. Maybe it is precisely the danger that we face from Donald Trump and from Vladimir Putin that will really finally force Europe to get its act to unite, as President Macron says we have to.
Quentin, bear with us. Angela, can I bring you back in? That thought about Giorgia Meloni being somehow the catalyst that might spark that change.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, actually. They don't agree, as Quentin says, on Ukraine, but she's a very smooth operator, and he is a very canny operator, and, you know, it looks like he would like money and certainly not to be locked out of some funding. The Hungarians have been punished, if you like, by Brussels for various transgressions and had money withheld from them. If that could be unlocked, it might help. I also think that people underestimate to what extent woke issues matter in all this. It's not just about economies and trade and defence. I think if he could be given some sort of assurance that there would be movement, a little bit less interference from Russia on too many issues, and maybe she could be instrumental in making that happen, maybe that would bring him around. But at the end of the day, Europe cannot allow itself to be held hostage by a country of 10 million people that does not appear to share what the views that are held by the others. That said, Quentin was pointing out, of course, how big a menace Russia could be, how big a threat it could be. It very much depends as well how close you are to Russia. As we know, all those Baltic states and those countries near Russia broadly fear it. And the further you go away, apart from Georgia and Maloney, certainly Spain sees it as much less of a threat. But Orban cannot be allowed really to hold so much sway. They need to find a way around this problem. He is a legitimate member of the European Union. They can't just trample all over him. They need to sort this out.
And the threat, it's not geographic, is it? As Quentin was pointing out, it's the cyber threat that's even more pernicious in many ways.
Absolutely.
And Spain can't shelter itself from that.
Absolutely.
We're out of time. Angela, thank you very much indeed. Quentin Peel from Chatham House, thank you. Quentin, I wanted to ask you about BAE Systems and their share price going about 20% after Keir Starmer made that announcement about having to rearm. But we haven't got time for that. But there's going to be big business in this for many, many people, isn't there, I think?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the stock markets, for once, are giving us a clear lead.
Quentin Peel at Chatham House, thank you for being brief on that one, but thank you for the depth you've brought to our understanding of what's been happening right now. Quentin Peel from the Europe programme at Chatham House, and thanks, of course, to Angela Diffley here in the studio, our International Affairs Editor. Angela, thank you very much indeed.